Awesome. So I am Kennedy McDaniel Bay. I work at Opentrons. I've been at Opentrons for about 2 years now. But for a little bit of background about me, my original training was as a biologist. I did my PhD studying appetite signaling in the brain and how genetics and nutrition play a role in that. After my PhD and postdoc, I briefly thought I might become a medical doctor. 3 years into training, I decided that I really disliked the US healthcare delivery system. I'm sure you've heard plenty of wonderful things about it. So I decided, well, look, I already have a PhD. I think it's time for me to go to the dark side of industry and see what I can do there. And the reason why industry was attractive was actually the same reason that medical school was attractive, which was that it comes down to really knowing, am I solving the right problem, right? Am I really helping people in the way I intend to? And that's something that industry has to focus on a lot. And I've really enjoyed over the last several years being at this intersection of biology and the silicon-based technologies of hardware and software, really pushing forward this idea that biology is also a fundamental technology, but it's still too hard to innovate with it, which is why I love automation. So I joined Opentrons because I see Opentrons as a platform that can lower the barriers to bioinnovation. And it's cool because Opentrons is a company that's a core part of our mission. We're a fully open source company, really premised on the idea that scientists can share what they do with each other directly, not just drafting it in a methods section, but actually saying, here's the protocol, now you can do the exact same thing I did. And there's so much opportunity there to improve the fundamental challenges of reproducibility. There's also opportunities to lower the time and monetary costs of innovation with biology. So in my dream world, it would be as easy to innovate with biology as it is with software. And we have a long way to go. But this is where education really comes in, because it's one thing to say, oh, this is a great tool, but tools are only as effective as the ability of people to use it, right? And when we look across, to back up, I'm kind of speaking assuming that everyone here knows about Opentrons. Let me just briefly summarize. We are a fully open source company. We have a modular system that includes a base robot. We have an OT2 and the Opentrons Flex. We have all open source software for using those robots that ranges from coding them with Python to non-coding solutions like our protocol library and our protocol designer. We've been lucky to find our way into thousands of labs around the world. And because we've taken this modular approach, there's a pretty wide range of workflows that we're able to address. But coming back to this challenge of what it means to know how to use our equipment, when we look across industry, there's actually a labor shortage problem, which is kind of crazy because there's tons of people who want jobs and there's all these job openings. So what's the real mismatch here? And when you survey across the industry, the major gap that they're saying is that, look, there's a skills gap. Yes, there's people who want this job. Yes, we have jobs to fill. But we have a challenge of getting the right people with the right skills. And a lot of that skill gap is coming into new techniques and methodologies like automation, right? And this is something that you've probably observed to varying degrees and in different ways that it manifests. Because you always want to have just the right person for the job. And we all accept that there has to be a certain amount of on-the-job training, but how much on-the-job training is really realistic is the question. And on the other hand, I think there's a good case to be made for why our products are really good for education, specifically Opentrons. I think that liquid handling is something that students need to learn, but I think Opentrons is a good solution for this. Because we have this opportunity to be able to address a wide range of workflows, which means with a single robot base and a relatively small footprint in a laboratory, there's a lot of things that you can do. There's also a lot of disciplines that can be taught using the Opentrons. So yes, we traditionally service biologists as scientists in the life sciences. Obviously, there's a lot that can be done with chemistry. But as you'll see in a moment, we've also had adoption from chemical engineering and computer science programs, because this is a great hands-on way to leverage Python and give a very interactive way to really advance Python coding skills. We just announced this education program just over a week ago now, so very excited about publicly announcing it. But there were some bleeding edge early adopters. Before we actually were trying to service education specifically, labs around the world were figuring out how to do this, and I'm really grateful to them and want to highlight how much they've really influenced this, because I've learned from talking to each of these professors really what it takes to do this well, and therefore what we can do as a company to make this easier for other educators. I think that the proof is always in the pudding, so I'll talk a little bit more about the program itself in a minute, but I want to just give you 3 quick highlights of some examples of how this has been used in practice. So one example is from Australia at Monash University. This is a master's level course for sequencing technologies. This is part of their genomic analytics program. And these students are going to go out into the world. It's a very hands-on master's program, because that's the type of jobs that the students anticipate taking. So something that comes up a lot when I talk to professors is like, hey, I still need to make sure my students know how to manually pipette. Of course, I get it. Like I was in a lab with somebody who said, oh, I know how to pipette, and proceeded to use the pipette without a pipette tip. And you can imagine how good of a mood the PI was in about his destroyed pipette. So yeah, we need to teach the fundamental skills also, because you don't know what's really going right or wrong in automation if you don't know what it's really doing. And the analogy I like to use is it's like math. You don't start by teaching 2nd graders with a calculator. You start by teaching the fundamentals of mathematics, and then how the calculator is a tool that lets you do more faster. Automation and liquid handling is the same thing. You have to know the fundamentals of the lab work you're doing, and then automation is a tool that you can leverage your own efforts through. So in this case, they take that approach. So students, they're going to be learning basic sample and library prep, both manually and automated. As they go through the automated, it's sort of a stepwise transition. So they start off with a very simple serial dilution protocols, and then they ultimately build their way into more complex protocol development, ultimately to do sample prep for sequencing on the Illumina system. To go to another example, University College London. So this is actually a chemical engineering program. What I think is really interesting to note about this program is that they work with an advisory board made up not only of the professors in the program, but also the industry, to really make sure that what they've built, it's a new program, what they are building all the courses and competencies around is the job skills that make their students the most qualified and most desirable candidates. For this particular course by Dr. Bawa, he has them do everything first as the manual process. The next lab session, they're going to do the automated version of it. But he really has his students start from the beginning. The first class the students have with the robot, they set up the robot and calibrate it. And then they're going to pipette UCL into a 96 well plate using a Python protocol that the students write themselves. And ultimately, though, they're going to advance into doing this chemical engineering process of assessing solubility analysis and doing that in an automated way, really making the point to his students that, hey, it took you 5 hours to do 16 samples, and that this robot is going to be able to do a multiplier of that in a fraction of the time. It also he uses that to make the point to students around data generation and data models. When you have 16 samples, you're going to do a different type of data analysis, but when you really do large-scale sample acquisition, you need to build different models to really understand how to analyze your results. What I love about this program in particular is that it's so practically focused, where instead of saying, oh, and here at this moment in time, or under these conditions, you'll use this methodology, and under these conditions, you'll use that methodology. And instead, he's presenting the students constantly with scenarios that force them to that realization on their own, which makes for a much more impactful and memorable learning experience. And then finally, I want to talk about Virginia Tech, because those are 2 more advanced ways that you can teach automation. Here, what Clay Wright is doing at Virginia Tech, it's at the undergraduate level, and he's actually starting the students from really thinking about the principles, how to automate, more so than programming. And so the first thing that they do with the robot is he hands the students a normal laboratory handout that he would use, and it's for a manual protocol, and he says, okay, go use the protocol designer, which is a graphical protocol designing tool that we have that requires no coding knowledge or experience. He says, go use the protocol designer and automate this lab. And the students go out into small groups and they do that. They come back together as a group and then they discuss what they did to automate each step and why. And so here you're going to have it naturally coming up, different conversations where students say, oh, well, I took this approach because it's faster. And another student says, but I took this other approach because it minimizes my risk of sample contamination. So there's this very natural way for students to appreciate what are the trade-offs and truly the fundamentals of what happens when you automate a process, not just the coding that goes into it on the back end. And by the end of the course, the students do begin to run some basic Python coding, basic Python protocols, but the focus of the course is really on the foundational knowledge of what it means to automate a process. And students from that program, they really love it. I'm not gonna make you listen to me read quotes out loud, but I do think this top left quote makes the point really clearly. This is a direct quote from a student where fundamentally they've gone out into the real world, they've been applying for internships and other programs, and they realized that they were a much more desirable candidate for having had this experience, even from a single course. So the thing is, why don't we have more robots in education? Well, the truth is, historically, they've been really expensive. And even though OpenTrons is a really cost-competitive liquid handling solution, we're really cost-competitive from an R&D perspective, and education budgets are just different and significantly lower. Once you are dealing with that, it's like, okay, cool. There's also the time cost to change the lesson plan. And there's also the bureaucracy barrier, I would say. Especially the more expensive equipment is, the more paperwork you have to fill out to prove that this is an acceptable purchase to your institution. So that's been a really key problem. And I'll come back, we have a discount, I'll come back to talk about that in a moment, but I do want to say what's within this program. We are including the full hardware support. So we have our OT2 robot. If you're really bent on wanting to teach with the Flex, that's great. We can help you with that too. We just recognize that for most educators, the OT2 is an excellent workhorse for the educational environment. We have the pipettes for that, the modules. Educators that come in through this program, they are full customers, so they get the standard onboarding support from our team. And then we also have protocol support for lesson plans, provided that educators are willing to share their lesson plans with other educators. And then access to our community. So you already saw we have educators around the globe. Many of them have been generous enough to volunteer their time to help other educators start doing this. So when we meet with somebody who's wanting to start teaching with automation, we understand what their biggest concerns are, and we make an introduction to educators that have overcome those same challenges. I know that this is a brand-specific program. I fully own that I am employed by OpenTrons, and this is an OpenTrons program. I do honestly believe that the skills students learn by automating in OpenTrons are largely transferable skills. These are things like, what are the actual, what does it really mean to have to deal with different liquid classes? What kind of troubleshooting do you need to face because you have bubbles coming into your tips? What does it mean to do a blowout and why? These are standards that exist across liquid handling platforms. So I promised I would talk about the discount. Basically, it's a quote-by-quote basis, so I can't say, oh, here's XYZ. We do have a price sheet for educators that I'm happy to send across to anybody who wants to explore the program. But to give you a sense of the size of the discount, if you were an R&D lab that wants to buy a robot, then you would be looking at about $20,000 to perform, let's say, nucleic acid extraction. If you're an educator coming in, that same equipment setup is going to cost you less than $6,000. So I'm not going to say that that's cheap, that's still a chunk of change, but that is also within the amount of money that there's a lot more grants available for. And at that point, it's really possible to pursue, as you saw in an earlier quote, it's possible to pursue multiple robots in some cases as opposed to just one as well. So I'm going to stop talking there and would love to just have a discussion with y'all. And I'm going to turn off screen share so I can see your faces larger.